The video you're about to watch is from the Brand Podcast Summit, brought to you by Lower Street. We're a podcast agency for brands. This was a 2-day event that brought together some massive companies like the New York Times, LA Times, Morgan Stanley, Atlassian, REI, YouTube, Spotify, a ton of companies, all gathered to talk about what has worked for them in podcasting and not worked for them over the last 12 months. And looking forward, what are they planning and looking at over the next 12 months? So if you're a marketer looking at podcasting this year, or you have a podcast and you're looking to improve on it or get more out of it, I think you're going to find a ton of value here. And so for more videos just like this one, head over to lowerstreet.co/events. And you'll also find information there about future conferences and summits we have coming up. So head over to lowerstreet.co/events.
The Brand Podcast Summit.
Hello, Brand Podcast Summit. Welcome back for another session. I'm so happy to be able to welcome you to this next session. I realized I haven't introduced myself yet today, so I will just quickly intro myself. I'm Annalisa Nielsen, and I work at Lower Street in podcast strategy and development. Super happy to be here to be able to welcome you to this next very exciting session today. It's called Am I Doing This Right? Presenting the 2025 Branded Podcast Benchmarks Report. Benchmarks are something that we are constantly being asked for from our clients. That's something that is really hard to figure out and to measure in podcasting, particularly in branded podcasting. I know a lot of people are always asking for that. So we're really happy to have Paul here today, Paul Riismandel, who is coming to us from Signal Hill Insights to share the latest report. This is the first time that anyone is getting to see this report. And Paul has been doing research into podcast effectiveness, basically since it was practical, so for over a decade. He is the president and partner at Signal Hill Insights, which is a research firm that has tested more major brands podcasts than anyone else. So we are very lucky to have him here. And we also have great news, which is that everybody who registered for the Brand Podcast Summit this year is going to get an email after the fact with a link to access this report early, exclusively in advance of everybody else. So we are lucky to have that from Signal Hill Insights. And Signal Hill Insights is also they're our gold sponsor for the event this year. So don't forget to write your questions in the chat, in the Q&A chat, and I will pop in at the end, about 10 minutes before the end of the session, to ask Paul some questions, 10 to 15 minutes. We'll see how it goes. So yeah, if you want your question answered, make sure to pop it in there. And that is all for me. So without further ado, Paul.
Thank you so much, Annalisa. I'm really thrilled to be here, sharing my screen here so you can follow along on what I'll be presenting. You know, here at Signal Hill Insights, we've been measuring branded podcasts for about 8 years. And so some of these benchmarks I'm going to be sharing here are part of that report you just heard about from Annalisa that we'll be releasing shortly. I'm just giving you some highlights here. And it comes from measuring all these branded podcasts. And the focus today is not just on benchmarks. I mean, benchmarks is great. It's great to know kind of where things stand, where maybe you stand. But I want to give you the story behind them to understand how do you achieve these benchmarks and what are some actual insights you can take back into your own branded podcast program. So before I get started, let's just think, I'm going to ask a rhetorical question, is what are some of the most important qualities of a branded podcast? You think maybe it's the host? Maybe the guests, if you have guests. The story? That seems pretty important. Maybe the sound design. And of course, I think we'd say all these things are actually really important. And anyone who's listened to podcasts for a while knows there are hundreds, thousands, millions of ways to do this and to do it right? Creativity is still a fundamental part of this. And so it's a little hard to be prescriptive on you should do X, Y, Z and make a checklist. So I'm going to take a step back then to try and get at doing it right and ask actually, what do we, a brand, a producer, what do we want from our branded podcast? And one thing I think everyone wants is that earned attention, right? We want people to listen, to watch our podcast. We want them to pay attention to it. We want them to give us their attention throughout. And we also want recommendations. All the research we've done points to the fact that a personal recommendation is one of the most significant drivers of discovery. That's how we find out about podcasts. Someone else recommends it to us. So in terms of building out a branded podcast and marketing it, you want that personal recommendation. And for your brand, you want a positive brand association, right? This is sort of fundamental out of it. You want listeners to come away with a more positive view, a more positive opinion, to feel more favorable about your brand as a result of having consumed your podcast, right? We want them to think about that podcast as a gift. You brought them something that they want and they appreciate, and as a result, they feel better about it. And that's what we call the halo effect. But to get what we want, it means we have to deliver what audiences want. And so over the course of these 8 years, we've arguably tested more branded podcasts than anyone else at Signal Hill. And the brands that come to us are generally looking to answer like 3 fundamental questions. What is the podcast delivering for our brand, right? Things like that halo effect. And then how do desired audiences perceive the podcast? That's key, right? You want to see, how does the audience feel, think about what you're delivering for them? And finally, and this is critical, how do we improve? Optimization. How do we take these findings and plow them into that next episode or that next season? So to answer our main question today really is, what do audiences want? That's how we know if we're doing it right. We're going to look at results from more than 15,000 consumers who've heard a full episode of a branded podcast. And in these surveys, they tell us what they think, what they like, and what they don't like about the podcast. They also tell us about the brand, what they know, what they remember, and of course, their opinion of the brand. And we analyze all this data, what they told us about the shows and brands, and we're looking for what we call key drivers between their feedback and the things we're looking for. So for the stats nerds out there, and if you don't know what this means, that's fine, but we used a Shapley value regression. Again, you don't need to know what it is, and I'm not going to give you a stats lesson, but just understand that it tells us what the most important factors are in contributing to an outcome. So let's start with some of that brand effect, what we want consumers to take away. We want the halo effect. We want to see that lift in listeners' favorability towards the brand as a result of the podcast. What we learned, what audience want, is a podcast that keeps their attention. So overall, 61% of listeners who heard a branded podcast said the branded podcast made them somewhat or much more favorable towards the brand. That's the benchmark. How did we get there? Well, out of 5 attributes they could assign to the podcast, the most important one is audiences said the podcast kept my attention for the entire episode. So what this means is, if the podcast kept their attention for the entire episode, then they were much more likely to say they were somewhat or much more favorable to the brand. Those things were very highly correlated. Another thing we want, right, is recommendations, right? So brand opinion goes up. We also want someone to say, hey, I listened to this really cool podcast. I think you'd like it too. I think it'd be really useful for you too. And what we found as well, podcasts also want that, listeners also want that attention. They want to have kept their attention for the entire time, and they want it to be relevant to them. So again, the benchmark is 63% of listeners said they would probably or definitely recommended the branded podcast. And again, what's driving that is the podcast kept my attention for the entire episode. Do you see a trend here? And as well, it was important, as we said, the podcast was relevant to me. These are the two top drivers. When you're able to accomplish this with the podcast, relevancy and keeping listeners' attention, then that recommendation goes up. Attention's a trend, right? But with all this focus on it, it begs the question, what drives attention? And this is doubly valuable, right? Because attention, not only is it a positive thing, we want listeners to take away from our podcast, that they felt like they were in it. We also want that attention, right? It's also an outcome that we desire, right? It sort of does dual duty here. So let's dive in to see what drives attention. Now, in the benchmarks, 75% of listeners who heard a branded podcast episode said it kept my attention for the entire episode. And that's those who said that they somewhat or strongly agree. 45% said they strongly agree. That's pretty good, right? And it's because we often are testing some very high quality branded podcasts. So what are the key drivers of this attention? Out of 4 attributes tested, 2/3 of the influence is down to just 2 factors. The first is, I was interested in the topics, right? Listeners saying I was interested in the topics in the podcast contributes to them keeping their attention for the entire episode. And the second driver is the podcast was entertaining. That makes sense, but it's good to know and test and have shown in the data that when they're entertained, it also keeps their attention. So let me quickly review, bring you up to where we are right now. So putting it together, if you want that halo effect, if you want that lift in favorability towards your brand, give audiences a podcast that keeps their attention. If you want to get those recommendations, make sure it's also relevant to them. And if you want to keep their attention, make sure it's on a topic of interest and keep it entertaining. Now, this seems all pretty clear and straightforward, but I understand it can be difficult to kind of then turn it into practical terms, right? Into the actual advice. So we're going to dig in a little bit more with some more data that we think helps to fill out the picture. So 2 of these attributes that we went through, I was interested in the topics, right? In a topic of interest, and the podcast was relevant to me. They're pretty similar, right? Interest, relevancy, not exactly the same thing, but they're pretty similar. And we find that podcasts that perform well on one tend to perform pretty well on the other. So we're going to kind of look at these attributes together. And the way we're going to do this is let's take some case studies, right? Let's look at a couple of podcasts that score well in this regard. And what we actually want to do is hear from the listeners themselves. So when we do our surveys, when we do a branded podcast lift study and survey, we always ask listeners to tell us in their own words what it is you liked or didn't like about the podcast. So let's look at a B2C personal finance podcast, right? So this is a podcast for consumers about personal finance that we tested. And look at those benchmarks there on the left. 85% of listeners agreed that this podcast was relevant to me. This was 14 points over our benchmark. And 89% of listeners agreed I was interested in the topics. That's 9 points over our benchmark. But what they said about the podcast, one person said it made talking about personal finance very easy to listen to and understand. Clearly, interest in the topic is active there. Another person wrote, it was a story about a situation I am likely to be in the future. So the topic was of interest to me. And again, they said interest right then and there, but they said it's a situation you're likely to be in the future, right? So relevancy. This person found the right podcast, and the right podcast found this person. Let's look at another podcast. This one is a B2B stories podcast. So it's for a business audience, right? As well, it's sort of about case studies, right? So telling stories about different businesses. This podcast performed very well. 88% of listeners agreed that the podcast was relevant to me. And 97% of listeners, so we're getting pretty darn close to everybody, agreed I was interested in the topics. And again, these are people who said that they somewhat or mostly agree, or strongly agree that they were interested in a topic. And in both cases, these scores were 17 points over our benchmark. So what did listeners say? One listener said, integrating what happened with good business decisions was incredibly interesting. Again, interest right up there in the top. They are flagging it for us. Another person said, it included details of specific individuals that I was unaware of. I found that to be an interesting expansion of the events. Again, interesting, but clearly this is a story which the person already had some background about, right? It was already kind of something which a lot of folks in business, they know this story, but they learned more, right? Real relevancy here is what the listener is telling us about in this particular case. So we looked at interesting and relevant. What is entertaining? Now, this seems kind of obvious, right? The podcast should be entertaining. But in fact, a lot of brands actually accidentally overlook this when making their first podcast. There are a lot of stakeholders involved often, and it's really easy to get super focused on the information and the brand objectives. Do we need to get our CEO in there? What do we need to do? What do we need to tell them? What do we make sure they take away? That sometimes you kind of forget about this factor to make it entertaining. Now, this doesn't mean your podcast has to be a laugh riot, right? But it should tell interesting stories. Stories are entertaining, right? So let's dig into a great example of an entertaining branded podcast. One of the most entertaining branded podcasts we've ever tested is one called Tell Me What Happened from OnStar. And listeners rate it as 87% said the podcast was entertaining. They either somewhat or strongly agree that Tell Me What Happened was entertaining. And this is 16 points over our benchmark. So this particular podcast, if you haven't heard it, uses immersive sound design and edge of your seat true stories of people helping people at the most pivotal moments in their lives. The mission is to solidify OnStar's position as an innovative personal safety and security service distinguished by human connection. Here's what listeners told us about it. And I love this first quote. It felt like a friend telling me a story on a phone call, right? So that personal connection, that's often what we talk about with podcasts, right? That there's this personal connection with hosts, with guests, right? There's an intimacy there. And so if you're talking to your friend on the phone and they're telling you a story, right, you're paying attention. Maybe you're riveted. You really want to know what's going to happen. And this podcast gave this listener that kind of feeling. Another listener said, I liked how it was so inspirational and showed how we can use our own talents to help others. It was very interesting to learn how geotagging and social media could help, right? Inspirational, entertaining, keeping your attention, interest, it's all there. And then the third quote we have to share is, it was a well-told story. Yep, story is important, right? Enough drama to keep interest without being over the top or sensationalized. And what that means in a lot of ways, without being over the top or sensationalized, is that you're not pulled out of the story, right? Going, wait, what? Oh, there's no eye roll moment, right? Instead, you're brought in, you're kept in the story. That's entertaining. And again, this is a branded podcast that has real business objectives that it achieves. It doesn't stop it from being entertaining. So how are you entertaining, interesting, and relevant? Because these things are a little bit relative. What's entertaining in one circumstance maybe is less entertaining in another. What's appropriate for one type of podcast, for one brand, for one vertical, for one audience, may not be quite as appropriate for another. So our number one piece of advice is you need to know your audience. This means know who you want to reach. And this is critical. Seems obvious again, but it's easy to overlook. Sometimes we get into this place where we want to make a podcast that's for everybody, right? But when you make a podcast for everybody, you're kind of making a podcast for nobody. So define who you want to reach. And then you need to know what they need. What do they need from you? What do they need from your podcast? And a great way to learn that is to survey them. And we might be able to help you with that at Signal Hill. And then know what motivates them to consume podcasts. We all have motivators, right? And there's no singular motivator, right? A lot of people like a podcast to accompany them on their commute. Some people like a podcast to accompany them while they're doing things with their hands, cooking, cleaning, and they still want to have something occupy their mind. Sometimes they dig into podcasts because they really, really, really want to learn something, keep up on events, or they just want to laugh, right? So we've done a lot of research actually on these motivations, and we've shared a lot of it on our blog at signalhillinsights.com in the last year. So looking at U.S. podcast listeners overall, we turn to findings that we have in the Demos Plus survey that we conduct with Triton Digital as part of their podcast metrics product. We asked more than 12,000 podcast listeners, what are the most important reasons that you personally listen to podcasts? Now, listeners could choose as many reasons as they like, and these are the ones they chose most often. You can see very high in the list, to learn something new. 42% of podcast listeners said that's why they listen to podcasts. 45% said it's to hear interesting stories. There's that word again, story. And then 49% said to be entertained. So pretty much half of podcast listeners said a very important motivation for listening to podcasts is to be entertained. And yet, while those are sort of commonly shared motivations differ by audiences. Not every segment of an audience or people into different kinds of genres share the same motivations. So it's also important to be able to dig a little bit deeper. And they may prioritize their motivations differently. Entertainment, learning something new, wanting to laugh or something like that, may be somewhere else in the scale, depending on their tastes and what they're looking for. So let's take a deeper dive into one of those segments. And again, this is something we shared on our blog in the last year. And in fact, it was our most popular blog post of the year, looking at both the motivations and the listening habits of senior executives. And a lot of branded podcasts are aimed to that B2B market, and a lot of them really want to bring in these senior executives. So if that's you, I hope you're paying attention. So for senior business executives, they told us that an important aspect is to challenge the way they think. That's a quarter of them, right? Say that. But if we compare that to other podcast listeners, those who aren't senior executives, right? Just a fifth say it's important to challenge the way they think. 35% of those senior executives, so more than a third, say they want to be inspired by the podcast, compared to about a quarter of everyone else. And then topping the list of those qualities that senior business executives over-index for, 35%, again, more than a third, say they look for self-improvement from the podcasts. Whereas a little less than a quarter, 23% of other podcast listeners say that's what they're looking for. So you see, senior business executives prioritize things a little bit more. And so diving into these motivations helps you make sure that you're including elements in your branded podcast that they might be looking for. So let's sum up here. To keep listeners' attention, raise their opinion of your brand, and have them recommend your podcast, make sure that the topic, that can be the topic for the series, it can be topics by episode, but make sure it's relevant to your listeners. Make it about a topic of interest to your audience, and keep it entertaining. To learn what listeners need and find interesting and relevant, and entertaining. You got to define your desired audience as precisely as possible. Learn as much as you can about them. We suggest part of that is a survey. And understand their motivations for consuming podcasts, right? They're coming to podcasts for a reason. You need to deliver on that reason because you're putting the audience's needs first. Don't miss on this. Don't sleep on this. Of course, when you make a branded podcast, you're looking to accomplish your objectives. There are things you want to get out of this podcast to deliver for your brand. But if you're going to accomplish that, if you want that to happen, then you need to be sure that you're putting the audience's needs first. And then finally, measure your podcast to see if you're doing it right. That's something we've done for dozens of brands to help them see how the podcast is performing and then how they can do it righter. See if you're doing it right, but see how to do it righter and optimize. So this is just part of the data that we'll be sharing in the full 2025 Branded Podcast Benchmark Report coming very, very soon. But it's an exclusive first look for all of you who are attending right now. You'll have a chance to reserve your copy. You'll get an email from Lower Street and the Brand Summit. But right now, if you just want to scan this QR code, you can also submit and get in line. And special surprise bonus, by reserving your copy now, you have a chance to win a new iPad mini. As you've heard on many podcasts before, terms and conditions apply. And unfortunately, we can only make the offer in Canada and the US. So if you're in Canada or US, in reserving your copy, you have the opportunity to win a new iPad mini. So we're very sorry to South America and Asia, Europe, Australia, and Africa. We wish we could include you, but you can still sign up and get that first look at the Branded Podcast Benchmark Report before the general public gets a look at it. So we hope that you'll go ahead and sign up. And Annalisa, I think I'm ready to take some questions now.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Paul. And this is great. I want to go sign up right away to get my copy of the report. I'm really excited about it. I think to start, let's dive into Signal Hill Insights has done research with some of the biggest branded podcasts that exist out there. You've worked with some of the biggest brands, and you've seen, I imagine, a huge variety of results from, measuring lots of different metrics with lots of different brands. I'm going to ask you a very broad general question. And I have the caveat is that it may not be applicable to every single brand, but based on what you've seen from collecting all of this data, what is the recipe for success for a branded podcast? What sort of makes or breaks the success of a podcast? I know you sort of summarized that already. But is there anything specific that you would say is a big mistake that brands make that leads to results that they're not happy with, or something that they do that leads to results that they are very happy with?
Yeah, the big mistake is going too hard, right? It is putting the brand too far up front and too much in the listener's face. That's the biggest mistake you can make, right? It's the difference between really great branded content or content marketing and an infomercial, right? So are you pushing a shark vacuum or a sham wow? That's one approach. And I'm not saying that can't be entertaining, but it is one approach. And you'll notice people don't necessarily opt in to watch infomercials, right? They happen into infomercials. They happen to be on. You don't, and maybe you're like, okay, well, I'm thinking about getting a vacuum cleaner, so I'll watch the I'll watch the shark infomercial, right? But people don't really go like, hey, that sounds great, and I want to listen to 6 episodes of it, right? So don't go so hard, right? The brand is is present. You want to let listeners know it's there, but it just can't be brand, 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 brand all the time. Like all rules, there are exceptions to this rule, like inside Trader Joe's, which is sort of all about the brand. But the brand has a mystique already, right? They've already done all this great work around the brand that makes people want to know more about it. So that's kind of a little bit of the exception that proves the rule, though, that if you go hard and it's just in your face about brand, it's probably not actually going to perform very well.
What do you find is the biggest piece of advice that you're giving to your clients when they wrap up on a brand lift study? Again, I imagine it's different for every client and it depends on the results that you see, but is there something that you find yourself repeating over and over again?
I mean, that's one part of it. I think more often, we really have to look at the results, and it's really got to be objectives based, right? So some brands are maybe still building awareness, right? Whereas other brands already have a lot of awareness. And so there might be different levers that we pull in that regard. A lot of it is, part of your objective should be a little bit of, what you hope listeners take away, right? So we do have, most brands are looking for that halo effect, right? The favorable opinion. But sometimes there's also sub-objectives. You want to associate the brand with something specific. If you're a personal finance brand, perhaps, you want listeners to come away thinking, I can trust the brand with my hard-earned money. Did that sense of trust come through? Were you able to convey it? And so we're going to look at the results and, of course, obviously closely analyze the podcast itself to see what could we do to enhance that. Or we can also say, hey, well, you got it right. Like, don't change a thing. Here's what you should sort of hold on, right? That's kind of the process that we go through. It's extremely consultative, and it really has to be customized to both the podcast, the creativity of it, as well as those objectives.
How do you, right at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about how, the brand has certain goals with the podcast, and in order to achieve these goals, you have to, do these certain things for the audience. So, it has to basically be a good podcast in order to achieve the goals that the brand has. How do you get your clients, how do you get a brand to start thinking in that way? Because it's sort of a pivot from like thinking about very specific business metrics into then having to first think about podcast success metrics first, right? If we want to achieve those business goals, we have to first achieve podcast success. And I find a lot of times brands skip that step, right? They go right to the business results and they don't think about the podcast success piece of things. How do you sort of get them to think about that as like the first step? How do you sort of show that like you need to have the podcast success before you're going to see the business results?
I mean, if any brand is thinking of making a podcast, I'm going to highly recommend that they pick a really good production agency. You just said that you have these consultation with clients where you try to help them kind of make that leap, right? So whether they're working with Lower Street or Jar Audio, I think that's kind of really important. Because to work with experienced podcast producers who also understand brand objectives, that's a big piece of the advice, I think. Because anyone who's done it for a while is going to make a good podcast forward. So I don't find, so much of the time, when a brand wants to test a podcast, frankly, they've made some of that investment, right? So they've already started to do some of that work. Now, maybe there's been push-pull in the background that we don't know about, right? Where they're pushing for more information, more brand presence, and maybe it's been a compromise. There's a lot that goes into how the sausage is made, if you will, right? And so when we tend to come in, right, I don't think we ever, we haven't really tested podcasts where it's like a failure, okay? To be honest. And you can see that in the results. The benchmarks are relatively good. And again, it's because if a brand is willing to invest in the research, they've probably invested in that production as well. So whether they're working with an agency or they've hired in talent in-house to work on the podcast, they've got an advocate for making it a really good podcast on its own. And so it really comes around to reading the results, right? That's the ultimate thing, is when you get the report card. And we've sat there with brands and said, yeah, your brand awareness, really great. Folks were a little less riveted though, right? So maybe we take down those brand mentions and take down that part of it a little bit, and we can think a little bit more about what's going to drive the engagement.
Right. Brand awareness doesn't necessarily work in your favor if it's not also paired with brand affinity.
Exactly.
If they're aware that the podcast comes from your brand, but they don't like the podcast or they don't like your brand, it doesn't really benefit you at all.
Right.
Awesome. There's a question in the chat here asking about the senior business listeners and their affinities. Maybe we could dig in a little bit more into that, and I could get your opinion on this. Why do you think that they enjoy being challenged on their views even more than other listeners? Do you think it's because they're not being challenged by others in their company, or where do you think that's coming from?
I mean, I don't think you get to be a senior executive without having been challenged on the way. You don't just suddenly show up there, right? You've usually moved up through the ranks. Maybe you started companies, maybe those companies have failed, and there's a lot of friction along the way. And so if you don't get challenged, I think that your likelihood of success kind of goes down. It can't be too easy. And certainly we can all think of particular cases in point of prominent executives who it feels like, I wish someone would challenge them now, right? But I think that those are the minority, right? Those are sort of very visible people. But I think folks in everyday circumstances, as much as being in the C-suite is every day, are dealing with challenges all the time. And in particular, if you have clients, if you have stockholders, if you have a board of directors, you're being challenged. And so I think it's helpful to be nimble, and I'd rather be challenged in a nice way and have somebody bring something to my attention or give me another thing to think about before I'm out in the marketplace getting my ass handed to me than rather than doing it later.
I think it also comes I think you can't look at it in isolation of that other key metric of being interested in content or in self-improvement as well, right? Like it feels like those two things go really hand in hand. And, part of being a C-suite level executive or a senior executive is being able to come forward and present really interesting new ideas to the group. And if you are being challenged on the way you think about things, then maybe you're going to also be able to either be presented with new ideas that you could then present to the rest of your team, or you're going to be able to come up with better new ideas that'll be creative and outside the box of what everybody else on your team has been exposed to. So that feels like they sort of are connected in a way.
Yeah, sharpening the knife. We definitely see that.
Yeah, exactly. Totally. There's another question in the chat. I'll ask maybe just two or three more. It says, it sounds like the common thread among listeners who showed interest in a podcast liked it and found it relevant because of the storytelling. Do you find that brands are neglecting the storytelling? And if so, how can they improve in this area? And I'm curious too, if you've seen that, maybe a podcast that you measured didn't show that it was as entertaining as it could have been. How can podcasters make that pivot, or brands make that pivot to sort of elevate the entertainment factor of the podcast?
Yeah, storytelling is hard. And a default mode, I think, often is the interview, right? Whether it's a long form interview or it's several interviews, over the course of an episode. And an interview can be information rich and story poor. And so story is about putting that information into context. And it takes talent to interview. Anyone who's really tried to do it and do it consistently knows that it's not easy, right? And then, there's editing. There's taking an interview where maybe, some guests are better than others, and helping maybe turn that interview into a story, even if it was a little hard to find. Or doing that hard work of saying, maybe this one's just not going to turn out, right? Not being caught in the well, we got what we got. we got to get this out by Monday and let's just go with it, right? Sure, everyone's been there. I'm not saying it doesn't happen or can't happen, and not, it's not about perfection, right? And there won't be perfection. And that's the whole point of testing and optimization, right? Well, it's not, you can't expect perfection on that first episode or even that first full season, but put your best foot forward, do your best, test it, come back, right? It's not one and done. We know this about podcasting, right? Don't just put out the 4 podcasts and hope somebody in 6 weeks is going to see it, or 6 years is going to see it, right? There is a thing about the craft, about continuing to go forward, continuing to practice, that I think is there. Whereas sometimes I think they can get viewed as very discrete projects. Okay, we're going to get this podcast out and do it. And that can kind of tamp down some of the tendency to want to really say, hey, what is the story we're telling here on this episode, regardless of how we're telling it? What is it? Is it clear? Can we hear it? Can we describe it easily? And I think that take a look at the OnStar podcast, Tell Me What Happened, right, is one that's focused on storytelling, even though very, very clear business objective.
Yeah. Maybe a final question, and this is I'm putting it to you again, even though it was kind of my first question to you. But so not to scare you, when you look at sort of the top ranking podcasts, because this is, we're talking about benchmarks here. We're talking about like sort of a meta-analysis of all of these amazing podcasts that you've researched. And, you're coming at this with more insight into this than I think anybody else would have. When you look at the top podcasts that are performing the best in metrics that actually move the needle for a brand. So I'm talking about things like brand affinity. We talked about brand awareness, but also I know that there are other things that you can measure that might be relevant to specific brands, but those are kind of the things that are universal, right? Every brand sort of needs this out of their podcast. What are common denominators of the most successful podcasts that you've looked at?
They know their audience, hands down. They have done that due diligence. Right? They know who it is they want to reach. Just every single one. And so some of them have gone and done kind of that survey research, right? I think you'll hear from someone from Red Hat who's really done that work. And we've written about that on our blog. I think that's super key, right? Really defining it and knowing it. And there's a lot of different ways you can know. And sometimes it's just because you're in touch with your own customers, right? I mean, that's a lot of it. And so you have a sense for what their needs are, and you have a sense for then what your prospective customer wants and needs, or where you're trying to go. But that's key. Profile, what do they want to know? What do they want to take out of things? If you know that, you are really far along in the process. And if you don't, then you're just kind of flailing about in a lot of ways, right? You might try a lot of things, and that's okay, but you'll see that in the results.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the audience who may not be familiar, Red Hat conducted a lot of surveys of their target audience. They put on a conference, and then they had some creative ways to collect that sort of information from people. So they would have them do a caricature. They had a caricature artist, and when they were getting their portrait drawn, they asked them some questions about what they would be interested in hearing about on the podcast, and also just a little bit more information about who they are as an audience, and that it helped to inform the content that they produced from then on out. So that's one idea for if you're interested in how you can sort of apply this yourself, or get to know your audience better. That's one creative way that we've seen that people have done before. Great. Well, thank you so much, Paul. I think that's
my pleasure.
That's it from me. This has been great, and we really appreciate it. And everybody go and sign up for the Brand Podcast Benchmarks Report, and you will also get a follow-up email to send you there as well.
Thank you so much, Annalisa. Thanks, everybody, for sticking with me here.
The Brand Podcast Summit.